My name is Jim Worling, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, though, there are a few quick housekeeping points. First, for participants listening in French, click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. I'm going to do my best to leave some question time at the end, perhaps the last 5 minutes. And to submit a question, please go to the toolbar on the right and click on Messaging and then Participants and type in your question. You can submit your questions anytime, and I'll do my best to leave 5 minutes at the end. Hopefully 5 minutes at the end. Hopefully I'll have some answers. And if you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants, and just let us know the number. And so now we'll begin. And I just want to say welcome. And before we begin, I know people are asking me, Jim, before you actually start talking about adolescents who've committed sexual offenses and the critical role of protective factors, do you not have any really groundbreaking, important public service research? And I do have some to start with, just to get us going. So the effect of wearing different types of textiles on sexual activity was examined in a group of 75 rats. 75 rats were divided into 5 equal groups. And the first group of rats, and these were all male rats, by the way, because when researchers study sexual issues, they tend to focus their investigations on males. So one group of rats were wearing 100% polyester underpants. The second group of rats had 50% polyester, 50% cotton underpants. The third group of male rats had 100% cotton. The fourth group of rats had 100% wool. And the fifth group of rats went commando, no underpants. I know you guys are thinking, this is such important information, but just hang on. So what they did is they measured the sexual activity of these male rats over the course of 12 months to determine whether or not the type of underpants they're wearing had any impact on their sexual activity. This is why I tune into webinars as well, to get the latest information. So do you guys think that the type of underpants that the rats were wearing had any impact on their sexual activity? You don't have to type in your answer, just think about that. I know I'm thinking too, I'm imagining the graduate student polyester underpants. The male rats had the most significant difficulty achieving erection and initiating sexual activity. The next group down was the rats with 50% polyester, 50% cotton. They had some difficulty. And the rats that had 100% wool, 100% cotton, or commando, no underpants, equal sexual activity, so no impact. And the researchers concluded that what happens when a male is wearing polyester underpants is 2 things. First of all, it gets a little bit too hot and then it interferes. And secondly, there's a small electrical charge that's generated when you're moving around in polyester underpants, and that interferes with penile functioning. So it's a good public service research. Anyway, I could go on, right? There are many studies like this, and sometimes, you shake your head like, why did they look at that? Sometimes I wonder, like, wouldn't it be great if we actually had research on other topics? For example, a lot of the work that I do is with other topics. For example, a lot of the work that I do is with sibling sexual abuse, where an adolescent sibling has sexually abused a younger child in the family. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had research that really helped to direct us to questions like, well, when is it best to remove the older sibling from the home? Should we always do that? Are there times when we can actually leave them together? Or if they have been removed, is there research that helps to guide our decisions in terms of when should they be returned to the home and how best to do that? I mean, that'd be fantastic to have that kind of research. And unfortunately, we don't. We have lots of studies like this, though, but I won't go on too much about those. And before I go on any further, I have to start with my favorite slide, which is this one here, my teddy bears. And the reason that I have to start with this is the most important slide. Because really, it's nice you take a break from your work, you're tuning into a webinar, and perhaps you work with children who've been abused, or perhaps tuning into a webinar and perhaps you work with children who've been abused, or perhaps you work with adolescents who engage in sexually abusive behavior. And it's nice you take a break from the work, but the only problem is you're now listening to someone who's talking about sexual violence. And I think sometimes people who are presenting tend to forget that their words have an impact too. And so I really want you for the next hour to do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. That's really important to me. The other thing I want to do is just say thank you so very much for tuning in. It's such an honor that you're taking time out of your life to listen to me speak, because I know I could equally be sitting in your chair listening and learning from you. So it's such an honor. I've been doing this work, working with adolescents who offend sexually for, oh my gosh, for 30 years now. And when the folks at Boost, asked me to do a webinar, I'm thinking, what am I going to tell them? What am I going to tell people? I've only been doing this for 30 years, and I'm still learning. Every time I meet with an adolescent, I'm learning something new about assessment, about treatment. It's such an honor to be asked to do this, to speak with you. So thank you so much for your time. And I also have to have a big shout out to my partner, Sabrina, because she's back at the ranch managing our kids. We have two. We have a puppy as well, and she has a full-time job outside of the home as well. And if she wasn't managing all that, I wouldn't be able to be with you. So thanks to her for that. Okay, so I'd like to move ahead and just start out with what I call my 5 Ds. These are the 5 myths and assumptions that I would argue have really been permeating a lot of the assessment and treatment work with adolescents who've offended sexually since the 1980s and still into today. I think some of these myths and assumptions still make their way into assessment and treatment approaches that many of the adolescents are subjected to. So, and I just want to go over these, and we'll talk a bit about them and some of the research. And I just want to go over these, and we'll talk a bit about them and some of the research behind them. The first is that, teenagers who commit sexual offenses, they must be sexually deviant, right? There must be something, oh my gosh, they've sexually abused 2 preschoolers. They must have sexual interest in preschool children, right? I mean, a lot of people go there in their mind and assume, well, there must be some kind of deviant sexuality, and that's why teenagers are committing sexual crimes. And that ends up focusing assessments where people are really focused on sexual interests and sexual arousal, and then it also impacts treatment where people are really doing a lot of work to try to quash sexual deviance. The other assumption is that teenagers who commit sexual offenses are really antisocial and delinquent. And some people even go as far to say, we don't need specialized sexual offense specific services. These are kids who are breaking the law, just like kids who steal or set fires, jack cars. We just need good delinquency programming, right? There's nothing you need. The third of the 5 myths or assumptions is that there must be something wrong, right? There must be a disorder that causes a teenager to engage in sexually abusive behavior. There must be a disorder. And I think part of the reason that people really passionately want to hang on to this is if it's not true that they're not disordered, then that would mean that many different adolescents could possibly be in a position where they're choosing to commit sexual crimes. And that's just something that people can't sit with. So that's an assumption that's often made. The fourth is that teenagers who commit sexual offenses can only be described by what's deficient, right? By what they're missing. We can't describe them by their strengths. No, we can't do that because they're filled with deficiencies, right? They lack social skills, perhaps, or this or that. But there are these assumptions that people make. And the fifth, of course, is that adolescents who commit sexual offenses are naturally going to be deceitful, dishonest, manipulative. They're not going to tell you the truth, or this or that. But there are these assumptions that people make. And the fifth, of course, is that adolescents who commit sexual offenses are naturally going to be deceitful, dishonest, manipulative. They're not going to tell you the truth, especially about things like their sexual interest. They're going to keep that secret. Well, and where do all these myths even come from, right? Why is it that people look at adolescents who commit sexual crimes and think that these things are true? I would like to think that it originates from the work that was originally done with adults who commit sexual offenses. And I think what happened in many parts of the Western world is people were working with adults who committed sexual offenses, right, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then when we realized that there are adolescents who are committing sexual crimes, a lot of programs who worked with adults then started working with adolescents. And they changed the adjectives and the nouns slightly, but they were delivering a lot of the services that were really programs that will work on sexual interests of adolescents by using adult-based techniques, or there's still programs that use risk prediction tools that are designed for adults, and they'll apply them to 13-year-olds. So I think that's partly how we got to this position. So let's just take these one at a time. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to sort of debunk some of these. The first one, that teenagers who commit sexual offenses must be sexually deviant. Well, we do have some data. We did a couple of studies at the former Thistletown Regional Center safety program back in the day, and we looked at, for example, okay, well, how many of these adolescents who've committed sexual offenses would the therapist say, oh, they have some deviant sexual interest, they're sexually interested in children or violence or both? And you can see from the data here that most of the adolescents in these two investigations, even though they'd committed sexual offenses, most of the adolescents here in these two investigations, even though they'd committed sexual offenses, most of the adolescents here had age-appropriate, healthy sexual interests. And I think a number of people will struggle with that concept because, again, that belief that they must be deviant is, I think, quite entrenched, but it's not true. There are also data from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, where they used to use a device to measure physiological responses, and they found the same thing, that, again, there was a minority of adolescents who offended sexually against children who would show sexual arousal to children in the laboratory. So it's not true. Right? It's not true that they're all deviant, and that's really important to hang on to. What about delinquency? Isn't it true that teenagers who commit sexual offenses are just delinquent, right? There's nothing unique about them. If we took 100 teenagers from, a combination, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, we took 100 teenagers, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, we took 100 teenagers who committed sexual offenses, and then we took 100 teenagers from the same cities who, were stealing cars. Would there be significant differences? Is there overlap? And so there was one meta-analysis done, actually was done at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health when Michael Cito and Martin Lalumiere were there. They did a meta-analysis, which you guys know, that's when researchers do research with other people's research, right? So they pulled together all the research they could find where people were looking at adolescents who offended non-sexually versus adolescents who offended sexually. And what they found was, there were some commonalities, things like IQ, depression, neurological abnormalities. I mean, there are a number of things where there were no significant differences, but here on this screen you can see there were some areas where there were actually significant differences, right? So adolescents who are engaging in non-substance use, affiliation with antisocial or delinquent peers, lengthier criminal history, whereas on average the adolescents who offended sexually, they had higher rates of abuse in their own history, whether it be sexual, physical, or emotional. They're also more socially isolated. They tended to have an earlier and greater exposure to sexual media. And so, to answer the question, no, they're not just like other adolescents who commit non-sexual crimes. There are some unique characteristics as a group, right, for adolescents who offend sexually. So what about disorder? What is the disorder? What's the one disorder that causes a teenager to choose to commit a sexual crime? You can't think of one, right? Because there isn't one. There is no disorder. It's not a disorder at all. It's a behavior, right? And that's something to keep in mind. There is no one disorder that would cause an adolescent to choose to commit a sexual crime, and there's also no one disorder that would explain most adolescents who offend sexually. So and researchers have looked and looked, and that's just not the case. The fourth is really just, that they can only be described by their deficiencies. And, you think about it, you can't just describe someone by what's missing, right? It's really important to also look at the other side, right? In terms of, strengths and protective factors, not just what's missing and what the risks are. I'm going to give you guys a sophisticated psychological test, and I just want you to think about, how would you describe how much water is in this glass? Thank you for being optimistic. I know some of you were optimistic. You're saying it's half full. That's right. It is. I mean, it is half full, and it's a real challenge to get professionals who've committed sexual crimes. And I understand. I mean, I get that. when you're looking at the information, an adolescent who's committed a sexual crime, they're coming maybe to your agency or to your practice, to the police station, and you're looking at the details of what's happened, and a violent sexual offense against a really young child, for example, it's really difficult to separate the offending behavior from the person. Right? It'd be really difficult. I get it. It'd be really difficult to think about that person in terms of their strengths and protective factors. But it's something that we really need to do if we want to prevent further sexual offending behavior. It's really important. But I can understand that it would be a struggle. The fifth D in my 5 Ds, I always, I tell people if I had some spare time, I'd write a book about this, but alas, I'm not going to. But the fifth D is that adolescents who offend sexually are all deceitful. D is that adolescents who offend sexually are all deceitful, dishonest, right? They're going to be manipulative. They're not going to tell you the truth, especially around things, for example, like their sexual interests, right? So if someone's sexually interested in children, right? If you have a 17-year-old and they're sexually interested in preschool children, they're not going to tell you. Well, I beg to differ, and there are actually a couple of studies that point out the fact that, if you ask them, they will often tell you, right? There are a couple of studies, one, again, by Michael Cito, Martin Lalumiere, and Ray Blanchard from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, back in the day when they used the penile plethysmograph with adolescents, that's many years ago. But what they found in their study was, most of the adolescents who showed sexual deviance in the laboratory were the same adolescents who said during an interview that they were sexually attracted to children. So they do tell you. And at the former Thistletown Regional Center safety program, that they were sexually attracted to children. So they do tell you. And at the former Thistletown Regional Center safety program, we too found that adolescents who said that they were sexually interested in children were the ones who are more likely to have engaged in sexually abusive behavior with the younger children. So again, it's not true that they're all necessarily deceitful, right? So hopefully, and I know it's a lot of information in a short period of time, but hopefully I've debunked some of these myths. I mean, hopefully you believe me that they're not all sexually deviant, right? Most teenagers who commit sexual crimes actually have healthy, age-appropriate sexual interests. Now, that's not to say that there are going to be a subgroup for whom, there is sexual interest perhaps in younger children or in violence, and that's going to be a risk factor. That's going to be a treatment target, of course, right? But it's not the case that they all have that, right? It's not the case. And that's why it's so important for us as professionals to do an assessment to determine, well, is this a risk factor for this youth or not? Likewise, hopefully I've convinced you that they don't look just like kids who are committing non-sexual crimes, right? It's not the case that they're just delinquent. I would imagine that in your own experience, you've interacted with a young person who's offended sexually, and it's their first involvement with the criminal justice system, right? And perhaps they're doing well in school, and the parents and everyone are scratching their head thinking, where did this come from? We had no indication of any kind of antisocial behavior, and all of a sudden, where's this coming from? And hopefully I've also debunked the third, is again, there's no disorder, right, that causes this, right? The fourth, I'm going to try to push this a bit as we keep talking, and that's the fact that, we can't just focus on risks and deficiencies, we need to switch gears and talk about protective factors. Protective factors are really the factors that protect one against re-engaging in sexually abusive behavior. And we need to push that because I think if we're going to help people heal, we need to work on their strengths and protective factors. And also, too, it's not the case that they're all necessarily deceitful and manipulative and lying, right? I mean, they can be honest, even about things like their sexual interests. And that's so important to keep in mind. And really, it's important to know how to ask the question. And that's where I think experience comes in. So for some people, I'm guessing I've probably, or maybe not, but maybe I've shattered some of your theories as to why it is that teenagers commit sexual offenses in the first place. Some people might be thinking, oh, Jim, I really thought it was the sexual interest. That's the reason. So that's why I said, well, you know what? If you look at the research, there is no such thing as a profile of a family. when an adolescent offends sexually, right? And families don't cause teenagers to choose to engage in sexually abusive behavior. So really then, why is it that adolescents do commit sexual offenses? I think it's a great question. I have one answer, and I actually was looking, I wanted to let you guys know when I started using this answer, because I started using this answer a few years ago. So I dug out my old transparency, which some of you won't know what that is, but that's for an overhead projector, which is an old-fashioned way of doing presentations. But I found my old transparency, and it's from 1992. And this is why I would argue teenagers commit sexual offenses. It depends. And I'm still sticking to this, right? 30 years into doing this work, I still firmly believe the reason why one adolescents committed sexual offenses, well, it depends. I have no idea. I have no preconceived notions, right? I'm not hanging on to those 5Ds. I have no idea why it is that one adolescent's chosen to engage in sexually abusive behavior. I have no idea, right? They're unique human beings, just like you and I, with unique family histories, unique sexual histories, unique personalities. What's the pathway? I don't know. For some of the adolescents I work with, the pathway is an extensive victimization history at school, right, with bullying and impacting self-esteem. And all of a sudden they're 13 and a half and they're very socially isolated. Puberty kicks in, sexual interest kicks in, and access and opportunity, a young child who lives close by, and distorted thoughts and attitudes about sex and sexuality. For another adolescent who's maybe done a lot of viewing of child abuse imagery, it could be a completely different pathway, right? And so I never know until I do an assessment. And it's really important to keep that in mind. And that is the most important reason why we do assessments, is to really understand what is the specific treatment that they need, right? They are not all the same. This is not the 1980s anymore, where what we used to do was take adolescents who offended sexually and plunk them into a treatment program where they all pretty much got the same thing, anger management and social skills training, and we used to work on their deviant sexual interests, even though many of them didn't even have that. Now we're quite wise, and we're saying, well, we have to do an assessment to figure out what is it that they need to be working on, right? Some adolescents really need to be working on self-esteem, others don't. Some need to be tackling the attitudes that they have around, figure out where is it that they should be living. Most adolescents who offend sexually can be serviced quite well while they're living at home with their families, right? And extracting a 14-and-a-half-year-old away from their family of origin, that's significant interruption in development. And that has to be done with a lot of care and thought. And it's often not necessary. But there are times when it is necessary to place a youth away from their family. And then there's the question of, well, when should they return, if they're returning back? And how do you do that work? So again, assessments are very, very important in that process, because they're not all the same. Right? They present, it's a behavior, a sexual offending behavior, and we don't have any information as to how they ever made that decision or how they got there until we do our assessments. The other reason that we do assessments is to measure whether or not our treatment's actually doing anything. Are we actually progressing and helping them to change their goals? That's really important, right? It's one thing to do your assessment and say, okay, well, here are the goals, but then it's really important to follow up and say, are we actually making shifts? Another reason that we do assessments too is this word here is risk, right? And so, and those of us who've been following the research for a few years, we know that the whole risk need responsivity model, or the RNR model, right, by Andrews and Botta, we know that treatment interventions for people who have been involved in the criminal justice system work best when we titrate treatment so that it's more intensive for people who have more risks, right? We know that. And less intensive for people who have less risks. We also know, based on the RNR model, that it's really important to target criminogenic needs, or risk factors that can change. So yes, it's important to look at risk in terms of what are the risk factors and what should be what should we be working on? The thing that I would argue that's a bit unfortunate is the field's really been focused on this, which is not trying to understand risk and how that's going to impact treatment, but really focused on how to predict the future and how to predict risk. And ever since the late 1990s, there's been a real push on trying to come up with tools and ways of actually trying to predict the future, and trying to predict which teenagers are going to commit sexual offenses in the future. And you hear some people saying, well, someone's going to be low risk or high risk. I would just argue, and I'm just going to put this out there, I would argue that risk assessment doesn't have to equal risk prediction, right? You can still look at risks. You can talk about the risks and protective factors that a client has without making comments as to how likely you think, because it's a guess, right? How likely you think it is that they're going to reoffend in a sexual way. Comments as to how likely you think, because it's a guess, right? How likely you think it is that they're going to reoffend in a sexual way. And there are real dangers to that too. And I can share just with you very quickly, if that's okay. I was sort of propelled into the whole business of trying to predict the future as well. And there are three things that happened in my life in 1999, just to let you know, that kind of propelled me into this whole risk prediction business. And the first was, I was actually at the Thistletown Regional Center safety program. We had data from about 150 adolescents who committed sexual offenses, some of whom we provided treatment to, and some of whom were in a comparison group. So I thought, well, this is really exciting. We could look at, does treatment work? Does it not? And are there some factors that might predict who reoffends? Because back then, in 1999, there was not a lot of research on risk prediction. And there were a lot of people working with adults who offended sexually that were coming up with risk prediction tools, which is the second thing that happened in 1999. Carl Hansen and David Thornton developed, you might have heard of this, it's called the Static 99. That's why it's called the Static 99, because they developed it and released it in 1999. And it's a risk prediction tool for adult males who've offended sexually. And it's used all over the world. And it's developed for adults. And what we found at the former Thistletown Regional Center was people started actually using that tool with adolescents, which is really problematic. Some of the variables, like one of the factors on the Static 99, just to let you know, is, if they've ever lived with a lover for 2 or more years. And I don't know what it's like in your neck of the woods, but I know here in Toronto, it's not the case, a risk factor. Right? So first thing is, sitting on all those data. The second was Static 99 came out, but people started using it with adolescents, which was kind of scary. The third thing that happened was that 10 years before that, so just work with me, sorry for all the math. So 10 years before that, so that's 1989, right? I was part of a team, and we did an assessment of a youth, and we called him, and this is terrible to say, but we called him a high-risk sex offender, because that was 1989, right? That's the kind of language that we used to use. We said he was a high-risk sex offender. I don't know why we didn't use any specific tools, because there weren't any to use at that time. Unfortunately, 10 years later, he's 26 years old, right? And he has a 4-year-old son. And it just so happens that this is one of those moments where all the planets and the stars all kind of align. Because at that time, Sabrina and I, our child, was also 4 years, a 4-year-old, right? And here's this client. We haven't kept in touch or anything, but here's this client that I was part of a team where we assessed him. He's a father of a 4-year-old. And unfortunately, what happens is, for whatever reason, and it wasn't nefarious, but for whatever reason, someone gets a hold of this old assessment report, this 10-year-old assessment report, and reads that he's a quote-unquote high-risk sex offender. And guess what Child Protection does? That's right. They removed his child. And that was sort of the sucker punch to the solar plexus that sort of, oh my gosh, okay, we have to do something different in terms of risk prediction. Now, hindsight, of course, is always 20/20, and I wish that when that happened, what I had said was, gee, maybe we shouldn't be trying to predict risk, right? Because of the ramifications of the words that we're using. Instead, I got swept up into the whole, well, we got to try to predict it better. We have to develop tools. So, well, we got to try to predict it better. We have to develop tools. So that sort of took me on a road to developing tools. just to let you know. In terms of, trying to predict, and thank you for listening to my story. I hope I didn't traumatize you too much, but it's important to understand, I think, some of the dangers too with these risk predictions. In terms of risk prediction, another thing that's really important to keep in mind though, and I'm just talking about this because I know people get really fixated on this whole trying to predict the future thing. It's really important to keep in mind the base rate. When you're trying to predict a future behavior like sexual violence, and it's important to keep in mind what the base rate is. In other words, out of Canadian teenagers who've committed sexual crimes over the course of 5 years, let's say, how many actually would reoffend sexually? Like, what's the base rate? If the base rate was, let's just say if the base rate, don't write this down because it's not true, but if the base, well, that's actually quite high, isn't it? And you might be really tempted to say high risk for a lot of the youth that you're working with, right? What if I told you the base rate was 10%? Well, you're thinking, okay, if the base rate's 10%, if I called every single teenager who committed a sexual offense low risk, right? I'm trying to predict the future and saying, well, they're not going to reoffend. How often would you be right if the base rate was 10%? Sorry for all this math. That's right. You'd be right 90% of the time, which is actually amazing. And that's better than any of the published tools or unpublished tools that are out there. It's really hard to beat the base rate. That's the issue. Because what is the base rate, you're asking me? I know you're asking me. I'll tell you. Michael Caldwell did a really great study looking at 106 data sets from all over the world, more than 33,000 adolescents who offended sexually, right? This is a huge, huge study looking at, okay, so how these adolescents who've committed a sexual crime go on to reoffend sexually within a 5-year period, right? That's the base rate. And so if you look at the published data, you'll see, okay, so it's about 5%. About 5% of the adolescents who offend sexually will go on reoffend sexually, right? Whereas almost 40% of adolescents who offend sexually will go on and get into trouble for something else and be charged criminally, right? So, I mean, there are a few things that sort of jump off the page for me here. First of all, the recidivism rate is a lot lower than many of us had used to assume, right? We were told and we used to assume that, well, there's a high chance of a reoffense and we have to, and I think it comes from those 5 Ds, right? They're disordered and deviant, etc. But look at that rate, 5%. The other thing that this really speaks to me too, though, is the general recidivism rate is actually almost 40%. In other words, when we're working with a youth who's offended sexually, it's important not just to focus on sexual issues, right, but also to help them to be, healthy, productive in their relationships with the world, right? And again, I think that's important. Now, some of you are going to be sitting there, I know it, you're going to be saying, well, Jim, is that really the base rate, 5%? Because there will be some situations where they're not detected. And I would agree with you, yes, it's probably a bit higher than 5%. But for argument's sake, let's just say for argument's sake, let's triple it. Let's say, and don't write this down, but let's just, for argument's sake, blast away over from the data and say, let's just say it was 15%, which it's not. But even if it was 15%, if you said that if you're trying to predict the future, if you said that every adolescent who offended sexually was low risk, how often would you be right? 8 sort of stress. There's some questions that people commonly ask. I'll ask you, could you ever, and you don't have to type, but just think about, could you ever answer this question? Is the youth at no risk? Could you ever answer that? Of course not. You can't answer that question. You could never say that someone's at no risk. That requires 100% precision, right? Which we don't have. Could you answer this question? Does the youth fit the profile of a sex offender, quote unquote? That's right. No, you can't, because there's no such thing as a profile of a person who's committed a sexual crime, whether they're an adult or an adolescent. There is actually no such thing as a profile. So you can't shop around and see, well, let's see if they fit the profile before we sort of proceed doing things in the criminal justice system or a child welfare system. No, you can't do that because there's no such thing. Well, how about this one? What's the risk of a youth reoffending sexually throughout his or her adult years? Could you answer that question? Things in the criminal justice system or a child welfare system? No, you can't do that because there's no such thing. Well, how about this one? What's the risk of a youth reoffending sexually throughout his or her adult years? Could you answer that question? No, you can't, because we don't have research that spans long enough, right? One of the longest studies that we have in terms of outcome is actually from Toronto, from the former Thistletown Regional Center Safety Program. And that was only a 20-year follow-up. So again, we don't know. We don't have the data to be able to predict that. And what about this question here? What's the risk that a youth will reoffend sexually during the next year, right? If we just limit it to 12 months. Now, I used to think that we could. And I used to tell people, and I used to do training and say, yes, I think we can. And there are tools. One of the tools that I think people are using is one that I certainly contributed to, called the Eraser. And there's the source if you're interested. Back in 2001, and it's been in the public domain since that time. But in terms of, how good do these tools work? It's really important to understand the statistics and the predictive validity. And I'm just going to try something here. I don't know if this is wise to do in a webinar, but I'm going to do it anyway. I just want to explain to you one statistic. I know you're thinking, this is why I went into policing or social work or child and youth work. Please don't tell me statistics, but this one's actually important to know because I want you guys to be really good consumers of the research. Because a lot of researchers have been using the area under the curve, or the AUC, when they're looking at recidivism research or reoffending research. It's the most popular outcome statistic used when you're trying to predict, is someone going to reoffend or not. And so just let me walk you through how you would interpret it, if that's okay, and then I can sort of show you some of the data. So let's just say we have a test that's supposed to measure whether or not someone's going to reoffend sexually, right? We have this test, and then there are two outcomes, right? You're either recidivist or a non-recidivist, right? Now, presumably, the higher the score on the test, the more likely you are to be a recidivist, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. So if I close my eyes and I randomly select a recidivist and a non-recidivist, how often would you like it to be that it's the recidivist, right? The person who reoffended, how often would you like them to have the higher score than the non-recidivist? And think about, like, what percentage of the time would you think it would be good to have the recidivist be the person with a higher score, right? If that test is any good. And you're using this test to make decisions around, taking a youth out of their home, perhaps, or providing, intensive sex offense specific treatment in a very limited, when you have very limited resources. How often, what's the percentage time you'd like the recidivist to have a higher score than the non-recidivist? I know you're sitting there thinking, well, Jim, don't be daft. Obviously, 100% of the time, right? So every time I close my eyes and I randomly scoop up someone who reoffended and someone who didn't, oh, it's the recidivist who has a higher score. That's a wonderful test, right? And that's how the AUC works. Just think of it like that. So if I told you a researcher did their study and they got an area under the curve of 0.75, that means, oh, on average, 75% of the time, it's a recidivist who has a higher score than a non-recidivist, right? But it also means 25% of the time, it's actually the other way around, right? A non-recidivist actually has a higher score. So, or if I told you, oh, they got an area under the curve of 0.5, you guys would be thinking, 0.5, that's just chance. That's terrible. You don't even use the test, just flip a coin. And that's how the area under the curve works. And you're gonna be thinking, why did I tell you all this? Well, it's just so that you could interpret this here, which is a meta-analysis of these very commonly used risk prediction tools. This was a study that was done by Jo Hoover and her colleagues, and they pulled together all the studies they could find where people were looking at these three commonly used risk prediction measures for youth who've offended sexually, and there's the AUC, right? And you can see they're all kind of hovering around that 0.66, right? Which means, now you guys know what this means now, right? It means, okay, 66% of the time, it's a youth who reoffends sexually who has a higher score. But that also means 33% of the time, right? A third of the time, it's actually the other way around. And that gives a lot of us pause to think, okay, oh my gosh. And I know when Jody published this study in 2012, it really got me thinking in terms of, wow, these tools just, it's really hard to predict human violence, right? And the same is true with tools for predicting youth general violence or general delinquency or adult sexual reoffending behavior. It's really difficult to get a higher effect size. So the nice thing is there are best practices now too that have been published very recently. 2017, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers published some best practice guidelines. And one of the things they mentioned too is that there's actually no reliable risk factors that have been discovered in research yet. So that's kind of a scary thought when you're thinking about, you know, using the research to predict the future, if there are no reliable risk prediction factors. The second thing that they're cautioning us about is to be very careful if we're making any predictions around future behavior for an adolescent, because we're often incorrect. And that's important to hang on to. The other thing is that the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers is saying, you know, if we're going to be talking about interventions for youth who've offended sexually, we have to move beyond just talking about risk factors. We need to talk about risk and protective factors. And think about it. Oh, that looks terrible. It looks different on my screen. And think about it. Oh, that looks terrible. It looks different on my screen, but anyway, I hope it looks better on yours. But maybe I'll try the next one. That doesn't work either. This is supposed to actually show on one side risk and the other side protective, and on one side problems and one side solutions. And I guess this is a good lesson as to why you use your own laptop when you do webinars, right? So many lessons you can learn. But yes, I think that I'll just move beyond that for a second and just share with you some of the really exciting research that we have in the field, letting us know that, hey, you know what? The message is getting through. We need to move beyond risk, right? And risk prediction. We need to move beyond that and start looking at, okay, well, we've kind of hit a ceiling in terms of our ability to try to predict the future. And like, why are we so obsessed with that anyway? Now looking at protective factors. And there have been other champions who've been trying to get us to switch for a long time. I remember Bill Marshall back in the late 1980s. Bill Marshall, who from Kingston, Ontario, was talking about the need to help men who've committed sexual offenses. You know, we need to help them with their self-esteem, with early attachment disruptions, because really, if we want to help men to stop offending sexually against young children, we need them to have relationship health, right? And that was back in the late 80s. And unfortunately, I think a lot of his work fell on deaf ears because many of us, myself included, just kept on that sort of that role of, oh, we got to predict risk. We've got to predict risk. What's really cool are these studies that are now coming out. I won't show you too many because we don't have a lot of time. But there's some really neat studies coming out now looking at protective factors for people who have offended sexually. And this is just one example of a qualitative study that was done with men who offended sexually. And I really like this one because it's qualitative. And I went to the University of Toronto, which tends to be a bit snobby with respect to research, and it's very quantitative and, you know, doing all kinds of fancy statistics. I like this one because it's qualitative. And in qualitative research, you know what you do? You talk to people and you listen to them. I know, right? What a concept. And you write down their narrative, and then you go and you analyze the data. And it's really fascinating what they've found. There've been a few studies like this already. And what they're finding is when you look at men who've committed sexual offenses and then they stop, right? And they stop for years. And you say, okay, so what's going on in your life? You know, because then we can learn a lot from this, right? So the men who stopped actually saw sexual offending as something from their past, right? It's an aberration. It's not part of them. You know, it's a small part of their history. That's not who they are now. So really looking at, and they're able to maintain a really healthy, positive sense of self and self-esteem. So again, helping to reduce the shame and to make them feel good as a person. Also, the men who stopped were the men who actually made a rational choice to stop based on their awareness of what the consequences are, like really understanding how it impacts other people and how it's going to impact their own life if they continue. There are also the men who are appreciative of the interventions, right? Whether that's probation or counseling. The men who stopped, compared to the men who continued, the men who stopped also were very much more hopeful about their future and their relationships. And they talked about the importance of being busy, right? So when you look at the narratives, they talk about how important it was to be, you know, engaged in their work or school, and to be kept very busy, and that makes a lot of sense. But it's a harder shift to get people to really start focusing on these protective factors with people who've committed sexual crimes. These protective factors with people who've committed sexual crimes, again, because it's hard for us to separate the person from the behavior. It's hard. And what about with adolescents? Well, another study that was actually begun at the former Thistletown Regional Center Safety Program. And this one that I started out actually in 2001. And it's a prospective investigation. In other words, we used measures and we got parents to complete these measures that talked about their child's strengths, believe it or not. As a psychologist, I use a lot of different psychological assessment tools because I took that oath in university, of course. I would make sure I do that. Now, they are helpful in an assessment. But a lot of the tools that we're using in the past really focused on deficit and disorder, asking about fire setting and alcohol use, and, aggression and depression. And I just thought we really need to ask parents. About their child's strengths. Like, this is too much focused on the D's, right? Disorder and deficit, etc. So I started using this one tool called the Behavioral and Emotional Rating Scale, or the BERS, which really asks a parent to rate their child on their strengths, and it's all strength-based, right? And in this particular study, we thought, well, is it the case that there are any, strengths that might explain which adolescents actually stop reoffending sexually? And so we collected data over an 8-year period, and it was really exciting. We used the area under the curve, and I won't go into lots of detail, but the equivalent is about a 0.77. So in terms of, 77% of the time, it's the youth who stopped, right? Who stopped offending sexually, who had these characteristics, right? So in other words, these are the youth who could express and receive affection. They could show concern for the feelings of others and intimacy, right? And so, as a treatment provider, I'm just really excited by this because I'm thinking, well, I can teach these things, right? I can work with youth and their families to really help youth to be able to, express and receive affection appropriately and to accept intimacy. And when you think about it, if you want to have healthy sexual relationships in the future, you need to have these skills. You need to have intimacy skills, right? So Bill Marshall was certainly correct and helping to steer us in that direction, right? So what's really exciting, and I'm sorry that I don't have time to share with you all the other really cool research that's coming out, but there's a lot of research now pointing to these protective factors for youth who've been offended sexually. And things like, youth who have rewarding relationships with friends and family are less likely to engage in further abusive behavior. Youth who have rewarding involvement in school and activities, who have compassion for others, who have really good self-regulation and problem solving, who have compassion for others, who have really good self-regulation and problem solving, youth who have healthy sexual attitudes, and who feel positive about themselves and hopeful about the future. I wish I could have a few more hours to show you all the research, but I can't. And some of you I know are probably thinking, well, Jim, speaking of research, do you not have any more research though on underpants? I know you're probably thinking that. So let me just share with you this one. I couldn't believe it when I found this one. These researchers actually found 8 men who were willing to sit in a cold room for 60 minutes with wet underpants while having their skin and rectal temperature monitored. I know, right? Who signs up for these studies? Anyway, some of the men were given wet underpants, some of the men were given dry underpants, and the scientists actually concluded that three things were constant. Number one, you might want to jot this down. The men wearing wet underpants always reported that their underpants felt wet. Number two, colder and less comfortable than the men with dry underpants. I know, aren't you glad they did that study? Anyway, so in terms of protective factors and, so what are we doing? Well, some of us, I am anyway, I'm deciding to, I want to start measuring protective factors. So I've developed a tool, in case you're interested. It's not on sale in the lobby, it's free. It's on the line, it's online if you like. And it's really a fairly simple 20-item tool that measures both protective and risk, right? So each of the 20 factors could be rated as either protective or risk or neutral, right? And that helps to guide interventions. It's not designed to predict the future or to predict risk. It's really designed to say, hey, what are the risk factors? What are the protective factors? And are there a lot of protective factors, a lot of risk? What's the level of intensity that we need to be working on in terms of the treatment, right? The other thing with the professor is designed to sort of range, because a lot of the other tools that are out there for risk assessment for youth who have offended sexually tend to have a very truncated range from age 12 to 18. And many of the young men and women I'm working with are in their early 20s now, and they may have offended, recently or in the, when they were adolescents. But then we're really stuck with, well, what measures do we use? Because, if they're 23 now and they offended when they were 17, can we really use an adult measure where the average age, is 34, or should we really be using an adolescent measure? So one of the things one of my goals with the professor was to really expand that age range from 12 up to 25 to also include the emerging adult population. And you've probably been following some of the exciting research, right, on emerging adults, that 18 to 25-year-old group, where they some of the brain research is showing us that they've got, 1 foot in mature adulthood and 1 foot in adolescence. And so that's one goal of this. The other goal for the professor was really to end up so there's not an arbitrary sort of guess at the end. And for some of these other tools that have been used for many years, there was sort of, people would say low risk or moderate risk, and that's a guess, right? There was no sort of formula or algorithm for coming up with that. And so with a professor, there is an algorithm for the end instead of making a guess. So, but if you're interested, it's there. And I just want to highlight, and hopefully this is going to make sense. I hope it does. But treatment doesn't come out of a box, right? If we have an adolescent who's committed a sexual crime, there isn't, the treatment. It's going to look different for every adolescent that we work with. I mean, think about it. We have an adolescent who has been involved sexually, for 2.5 years with a younger sibling, committing sexually abusive behavior with a younger, has been involved sexually, for 2.5 years with a younger sibling, committing sexually abusive behavior with a younger sibling. Even the reasons why they started doing that are going to be quite different from the reasons they kept doing it, right? I mean, 2 years of that, easy, access to a younger sibling in the home, intrusive sexual behavior. Perhaps you might be looking at sexual attitudes, sexual interest. You might have to be addressing self-esteem. Who knows, right? Again, you have to do your assessment. Or you may be working with an adolescent in Canada where they've, used their smartphone. They've taken a picture of themselves when they were nude, and they've sent it to a consenting romantic partner. And for whatever reason, that gets detected. And in Canada, that's producing and distributing child pornography, right, or child abuse images. And the sort of the intervention, imagine, you do your assessment and you find that otherwise, imagine, you do your assessment and you find that otherwise, the youth is quite healthy. You can imagine that the treatment's going to look quite different, right? And there's everything in between. And that's why it's really important to do the assessments to figure out, okay, so what should treatment look like, right? Should this youth be at home? Should they not? Do they really need a specialized residential treatment center, right? I mean, as I said earlier, most adolescents who offend sexually are well treated when they're still living at home, right? Or sometimes perhaps with extended family or friends. And again, do they all need to work on their sexual attitudes? Not necessarily, right? And again, the importance of just social media and sexual media, that's certainly consumed a lot of my work lately in terms of just the easy access to some of the sexualized, distorted the adolescents are being exposed to. Yes, that's quite common for me to be working on, but again, not with every adolescent, right? That's why we have to do our assessments. So, I'm probably sounding like I'm going on, but really, and I hope you don't mind all my visuals, but I really do believe that this is where we need to be going. And that's, building opportunities for sexual health is really where we need to go. We have an adolescent who's, engaged in violent sexually abusive behavior with someone else. We want them to stop, right? So one of the best ways to do that, though, I'm arguing, is that, well, why don't we build opportunities so they can actually experience sexual and relationship health? Because if they can experience sexual and relationship health, they're going to be much less likely to engage in abusive behavior, right? They're going to have a more productive and happy future. I mean, that's really the goal. It's like crowd it out, right? Crowd out the deviants. It's a hard sell. It's a hard sell because I'm just imagining, some of you are probably sitting there thinking like, what are you talking about? This person's done this horrendous, violent sexual offending behavior. Jim, how could you possibly be talking about strengths and protective factors, right? Shouldn't we be doing the punishment and making them feel ashamed? And no, I mean, that's not going to help. And I'm not saying that we need to not address their sexually abusive behavior. Of course we do that too. So for an adolescent who's offended sexually, of course we're going to spend time understanding, okay, so what is the pathway that led you to choosing to commit sexual offenses, right? What are some of the triggers and some of the warning signs, right? And some of the decision making and some of the attitudes that would have perpetuated that behavior. Of course we're going to work on that. But now, even more important, we're going to be focusing our attention on protective factors because we want to build up the capacity for sexual health. It's so important, right? Sexual health, it's so important, right? So things like, making sure they have good self-regulation and good decision-making skills and healthy pro-social sexual attitudes, right? And strong relationships with family and a strong level of engagement in, recreational leisure activities, right? So they're kept busy and productive and engaged and interested. It's also important. So again, I think that's the field is definitely shifting there, and it's exciting to see in research and practice. And I want to make sure I leave 5 minutes at the end, but I do want to end with my geese. I hope you don't mind. But this also happened in 1999, and this sort of ties in nicely for me from that story that I shared with you. But I remember this because I remember being near Lake Ontario with my son Andrew when he was 4 years old, and this was all at the time when all that craziness was happening back in 1999. And a flock of Canadian geese went flying. We said, "Dad, look at that!" And we looked up, and oh yeah, that's cool. And he said, "Why do they fly like that?" And I said, "I don't know. Let's look it up." And we looked it up, and we found some really neat facts that, to me, really speak to the need for us to work together. Right? I mean, this is an incredibly complex issue, sociologically and psychologically, and whether we're police, social work, child and youth work, child protection, hospital, wherever, we need to work together. And I think if we could work together like Canadian geese, we'd do better. For example, did you guys know that when the geese fly in a V formation, they go about 70% further than a goose flying by itself? I know, right? So we need to work together. Did you also know this? The geese honk from behind to keep up those, to keep those up front, to keep up their speed, right? They're encouraging each other. And this is really important. If one goose gets shot or injured or ill, two other geese will fall out with that, out of formation, and they'll go down with that goose, and they'll wait till it heals, and then they'll go and join either the original Canadian goose. We'd work together because, when we're working with adolescents who offend sexually, very disenfranchised group, and I think it's just so important for us to focus on their protective factors as well. And I'm sorry that I didn't leave 5 minutes, but I do have a couple of minutes, I think, for a question or two. And I'm sorry I don't have more time. Thanks for your help. Problem is I don't have any answers, but maybe that's a good thing. What's the name of the tool? So I'm not sure which tool you're referring to. Maybe you're talking about the tool that measures protective factors, because that's nowhere here. It's the behavioral and emotional rating scale. That's behavioral and emotional rating scale is the one that measures strengths. And the name of the tool that I cooked up called Sir, but you have that. Awesome. So another question, do I know the statistics in terms of how many adolescents who commit sexual offenses will have a victimization history? Yeah, I do. So just very briefly, there have been a couple of reviews of this. If we look at males who've offended sexually, it depends on the study, it tends to be roughly between 30 and 40% who also have a sexual abuse history, which means to me, most males who offend sexually don't have that history, right? But it is higher than the national average. So for some youth, that is a factor in terms of the early history. For adolescent females, though, the incidence rate is much higher. So adolescent females who are engaged in sexually abusive behavior, it's closer to about 75%. Awesome. You guys are working together like geese, so this is awesome. So I'll leave you there, and thanks so much.